Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. If you don't know by now, my name is Elaine. I'm the head of partnerships here, and I work with Matt to bring you this free weekly webinar every Tuesday at 11 o'clock. Delighted to have so many join us today, and clearly a topic that has sparked imagination and interest, and actually a really important one that we know can be really emotive, really passionate, that people really care about. So I'm delighted to welcome Eleanor to talk to us today about all things kind of, I guess, the culture around complaints, and that's what's really important. How we as kind of landlords and a sector view the kind of power of complaints and what they can do. We really want to avoid getting into kind of nitty-gritty or kind of individual cases today, because I think what we're trying to do is make the sector a better place and create a platform to have a really kind of creative conversation, I guess, about what we can do better, what we could do differently, what's working really well. And as a bear with me one second. And as always, this is a community that will appreciate discussion, debate, and kind of is based on a grounding of real respect. So just a reminder of that, as always. I think I need to welcome Eleanor just after I thank our sponsors. So to keep it free and to keep us going, I want to thank Alertical and CMSG, who sponsor us into kind of 25 and 26. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Eleanor, who's going to take the stage. I haven't got any slides today. We're just going to start that conversation. As always, pop your questions within the chat as we go along. And then once Eleanor's kind of set the scene, I will kind of break out and you can pop your hand up and want to come in if you want to. So, Eleanor, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having me here today and for joining you all at the round table. I'm Eleanor, a customer experience, complaints and transformation consultant at the Complaints Coach. And what I'm going to cover today about complaints might not be perhaps quite what you're expecting, and it's almost certainly not the expected position that we see shared a lot in reports or perhaps on LinkedIn, particularly if you're a resident. I think the least interesting thing that I'll cover today is my background, but I've spent nearly 2 decades in social housing, leading large teams and transformation programs. But if you want my background or to chat further, you can most certainly find me on LinkedIn. I now work alongside housing providers, independently advising and leading on work that improves services for residents. I know firsthand the catastrophic effect on residents' lives when things go wrong. And at the same time, I've seen many good people burnt out working in housing. And I'm here to bridge that gap and hopefully make life a little bit easier for everyone. It might be clear, given the subject that we are talking about today, or perhaps it will be by the end of our session, that I could talk about complaints with every single one of you long into the night. But what I'd like to unpack with you today is 3 things that we can take back to our organisations, both staff members and residents, that can be done today to change our organisational culture. These are things that can be done right now, not tomorrow, not after a culture reset programme, but things that can be done in the here and now to move things on and make services better and easier for residents. We often talk about culture, and specifically complaints culture, as though it's something abstract, almost mythical, as though it lives somewhere over there in another team or owned by someone else. But culture doesn't start or end with a statement on the wall. It isn't created by that reset programme, and it definitely isn't driven by HR. Complaints culture is far more practical and more powerful than that. And it begins with a clear definition of what good looks like. It requires us to set explicit standards for the activities that matter most, and it demands a framework to measure and monitor those standards. And most of all, it must be built in genuine partnership with residents. Now, underpinning all of our conversations today is my profound belief that what culture actually is working in a way that gives residents more dignity, more choice, and more control over what happens in their homes. And with that in mind, hopefully that's a good place for us to start. So handling complaints well is a sign of a healthy culture. And a healthy culture then uses complaint feedback to improve and prevent the same thing happening again. The most meaningful way to impact both is to move the emphasis point of complaints from resolution to restoration. But really, what do I mean by that? So most housing providers are focused on resolving a complaint and will be having conversations internally amongst their teams, saying things like, was the complaint closed? Was the response on time? Was the policy followed? And the behaviours and actions of making it feel good for the residents come down to the individual they deal with, rather than a consciously designed system. And that gap is then bridged by having organisational values, things like we do the right thing, we're always kind, we treat our residents like how we would like a loved one to be treated. Now, these on the whole are quite ineffective, because doing the right thing or being kind or compassionate is very likely to mean something different to each person. These things aren't inherently bad. Resolution isn't inherently bad. But when we focus on leading teams and delivering work that's driven from those questions, what we tell our people about the task that they must do or the way that they undertake them means that we often put complaint closure and response times and policy ahead of anything else. And this isn't a criticism of individuals working in those processes. I've led complaints teams, and I did the same before I learned how to step into that restoration phase. And I know for me, at least, it's a little bit uncomfortable to admit, because I ended up working in a way that didn't always reflect my own values or the integrity that I feel that I have. But when we work in a resolution mode, it's the mode that leaves things like working in partnership with residents, acknowledging the impact on them, and really learning from complaints. It moves it from happening by chance to a purposeful outcome of the complaint system. And when we move to restoration, we focus on those things as a primary purpose. Now, focusing on complaints restoration puts rebuilding trust, restoring safety, and returning both choice and control to the resident at the very centre of what we do. It's a design system and a series of behaviour that changes how it feels to be a resident with a complaint. Now, you might be thinking, gosh, that sounds really easy. She's telling me things I already know. But to work consistently in that restoration-focused way, especially under pressure, requires a shift in behaviours that in reality is more radical than it should be. In resolution, doing what you say you would do and asking what outcome are you seeking is enough and is the standard. But when you're working in a restorative way, that's really the minimum. So perhaps right now you're wondering whether your organisation takes a resolution or a restoration first approach. So there's quite an easy way to tell. If you as a resident have ever looked at the KPI results or the performance results of your housing provider, and you can see they're improving or some things are marked as green, but have felt that it doesn't reflect your lived experience or that of your neighbours, the chances are it's because your housing provider takes that resolution first approach. And if you're a staff member and have ever been asked to explain how that data was collected, or a resident has said to you that they don't trust the survey results because it feels so different to their experience, that's your sign that you too are probably working in a resolution over restoration culture. Now look, like I said, there's nothing inherently wrong with resolution, but for complaints to influence your culture and your culture to reduce the volume of complaints, you need to move it to a restoration model rather than resolution. So what do I mean by that? So when we focus on the resolution of a complaint, we fix the repair and get the stage 1 or 2 response out in time, hopefully. But that's a hygiene factor. It's the bare minimum of what needs to be done. And what it doesn't do is actively address the broken trust a resident will feel or acknowledge the emotional impact that a resident has often felt because of the ongoing situation. So how do we move that on? How do we move from resolution to restoration? Well, it starts with the board. So at the board level, one of the most effective ways to move from resolution to restoration is reviewing the data and information that's shared with you. if right now the board receives complaints reports or reports focusing on compliance around complaints, and that could look like complaints themes, for example, or compliance with the Housing Ombudsman Code, those things have to be in place. But actually, a small spot can be also including reporting about looking at reoccurring root causes, tracking them, and then setting the standard that those issues that can be avoided must be. And that then filters down to the organisation and shapes how staff members approach things. And it will also be about having conversations at board level about how rebuilding trust with residents very consciously and then measuring it is a better indicator of how things actually feel than customer satisfaction scores. And that will also get the board much closer to how it actually feels to be a resident receiving a service. At a complaints level, as perhaps the manager or an investigating officer, at the beginning of complaints, we often ask, so what outcome are you seeking? How would you like me to resolve this for you? But we can start adding in other questions like, what can I do to help you feel safe again following that leak? Or how can I help restore your trust in us? And when we ask those questions consistently, we start to rebuild that relationship with the individual. But again, change that emphasis point of the minimum we're going to do is get it fixed for you, but actually we're going to rebuild our relationship in the same process so that you feel confident and safe at home. That also then extends to be able to confidently say to a resident, that was a really tough thing that you've been through, and I'm sorry that you had to. And actually, what's been in the press this week from the Housing Ombudsman is their new guidance on how to apologise to residents. And so that should be telling us that we're not very good at it and we've still got a bit more work to do. And when I think about my experiences of reporting a complaint about any of my service providers, the times that I really remember is when someone says, actually, you know what, Eleanor, that wasn't good enough, and I'm really sorry you had to deal with that. And it's simple, but we rarely hear it. And then as a complaints manager, there is something in there about needing to be a little bit bolder and every single day having the conversation within your teams about what's the risk of the same issue happening again, and where it is at risk, taking real-time action rather than waiting for quarterly reporting to do something about it. And then at an individual level, every person in an organisation, from the board to people answering phones, in every choice we make, whether it's picking up that phone, sending an email, designing a new service, or giving advice to a colleague on how to do something, we have to stop and ask ourselves, is there a way for me personally, to give this resident more dignity, more choice, and more control over the situation? And when we start thinking in that way, it's exactly that nudges the behaviour on and nudges that change in culture. The key differentiator here, though, is not doing it as a one-off, but as a continuous way of thinking and working. And what's really interesting to me when I work with organisations and I'm helping them do this is that when you move to that restoration first approach, is that it isn't heroics. It's not when we've managed to resolve something or given someone a really generous gift or turned up at 3 a.m. And it's not more budget that's needed. It's in asking more questions and acting on them openly and honestly, even if what you're hearing is a little bit uncomfortable. And when we start thinking in that way, and when we start working in that way, it's much more effective in changing culture than any value statements. And in fact, those values go from nice artwork on the walls or graphics in the strategy to something tangible that residents can actively feel. And ultimately, that's what culture is. Now, the second area of focus to move your culture on is having KPIs that drive the right behaviours. Now, most of us have at some point probably heard the statement, what is measured improves, or a more snappy version of where focus goes is where energy flows. And it's certainly my experience that what you measure is what drives the right or wrong behaviours. When the Housing Ombudsman Code of Practice came into effect, it required landlords to be able to track and report on a number of things, like the average days to respond to a complaint, or what percentage of complaints were resolved within timescales. Now, these things need to be in place from a regulatory and assurance perspective. But by having just compliance KPIs, you place the compliance factors above the experience of the resident. And if you focus on those compliance factors, like speed or resolution, your service becomes optimized for that. If you focus on complaints themes, for example, over looking at reoccurring root causes, your service gets shaped around that. So what we can do to change that, to balance that, is that we can add in KPIs around the resident's experience. And in doing so, you bring their experience to the fore. It drives behaviour of staff members. And ultimately, again, it's what nudges that culture forward. So some really effective examples that I have seen in organisations that I've worked with is asking the resident at the end of their complaint whether they had more, the same, or less trust in their housing provider compared to before they reported their complaints. It's asking them whether they felt believed and listened to. It's asking whether they felt the more, the same, or less safe in their home before the complaint versus after. And it's asking about them, their confidence in reporting a complaint to the landlord in the future. Now, when you pull these together with the final metric that I want to share, what you start doing is changing where that focus and therefore where the energy of the organisation is spent. So in addition to those resident-focused KPIs, most organisations at the moment, the complaints KPI sit within a complaints team. But actually, if you move some targets over to individual service areas, focused on reduction of recurring root causes that they fully own, we then start to see those things come down. So, for example, I was working with a London-based landlord, and their main area of reoccurring but avoidable complaints failure was around missed appointments. We then moved the responsibility for reducing the percent of missed appointments as that reoccurring root cause into their KPIs. And we saw month on month for 4 months that figure come down because we were making sure that by giving that focus, that's where they were directing their energy. And that's a really easy way to make sure that actually, as an outcome of the complaint, we are genuinely learning from it. If landlords truly want to improve the resident experience and their complaints handling culture, it's in deep diving those questions that they'll be able to do that. My experience is that housing providers are sometimes a little bit nervous about how they use this information, or that they feel that they need to have a whole systems approach to improvement or all of their data perfect before starting. But actually starting somewhere, listening to that feedback about those areas, focusing your teams on it and doing something about it right now, even before things are perfect from a data perspective or from a systems perspective, will do far more to culture and the resident experience than any new shiny AI system possibly could. And it's an area that most organisations, certainly everyone that I've been into, can take up quite quickly to rapidly change how it feels to be a resident experiencing a complaint and going through that process. And then the last area that I want to focus on is perhaps the most important, but in my experience, the most difficult to get right at scale. And that's around resident influence and making sure that they have genuine control. So it's my experience that there are some residents who would like to be involved with the board and formal resident structures, and that's great. I've worked with lots of residents and lots of organisations to set that up and help make it work long term. But my experience is also that where the majority of residents want to be involved, it's in what happens in their home and in their neighbourhoods and in their local communities. And it's really important in complaints and in building the right culture that there's the opportunity for both to happen. So at a strategic level, things that I've seen work really well to shift that complaints culture forward is creating resident complaint advisor roles at committee or board level, and having them supported by an independent trainer or coach, and working in a way where they are the constant challenger of, is this restoration or is this resolution? And that really reinforces that culture change in every conversation that's being had. I think there are other opportunities like resident involvement in helping to procure training providers for complaints or in the materials of customer service training. And where possible, having it co-delivered with residents who are able to share their experiences to shape how staff see the way that services must be done. And really importantly, having that resident involvement in the co-design of the organisation's KPIs and the reporting framework and structures to support that. At an operational level, training and really importantly, paying residents to carry out quality assurance and then linking this to the performance reviews of individuals is one of the most impactful ways I have seen to shift complaints culture. In an organisation that I was supporting, we were carrying out what we called 1 year on reviews. So on certain types of complaints issues, either where they'd been long-standing or where it had been a reoccurring theme that had impacted other residents, we would commit to carrying out a 1 year on review and invite those residents back in. So we would share with them what we have done to address this so it doesn't happen to other residents. And we would share data and insight about the percentage of times or the number of times that it happened subsequently to their complaints. And what we started to do here is design a system where there's accountability in action in real time. And again, finally, and we probably, like I said at the beginning, could talk about this all day, one of the really effective ways that I've seen move culture on together is in holding roundtable conversations, very, very similarly to what we're doing today, between residents and colleagues on some of those sticky complaints issues so that it can be tackled together. And actually, I'm always reminded when I talk about this of a resident that I worked very closely with. And she reminded me very wisely that doing this work might be my 9 to 5, but it's her 5 p.m. until 9 a.m. And actually, when you bring both of us together around the table, that's when we've got the best chance of moving forward and nudging that culture on. So that was a very brief whirlwind tour of the practical things that we can do to move from resolution to restoration. And organisations where I have seen and heard residents say it actually feels different, it feels better, are the ones where they're able to step into that restoration way of thinking and working over resolution. And in doing so, that's where they shifted their culture on. Moving your culture forward and dealing with complaints more effectively is intrinsically linked. There's no escaping it. And what we haven't discussed today is some of the wider issues impacting complaints: poor services, the quality of homes, and even being able to recruit and retain the right people. These things impact complaints, of course, naturally, but actually everything that I've shared with you today can be done and put in place to help move your culture forward, regardless of those things. I will shortly open up to questions, and I can see coming through, and so I'm sure we'll have some very interesting conversations there. But I just want to make one final point, and I suppose this really is to my colleagues in the sector, because every resident here will know this much more than I will. But culture is not what we say in those shiny strategy documents that get published, but it's in what we reinforce and the structures that we consciously put in place to deliver that. It's in every decision we make, it's in what we respond to or what we let pass by. And it's one of the most powerful things that we can do to change culture in complaints and in working with residents more broadly, is simply pausing to ask ourselves, how can I give this resident more dignity, more choice, and more control? And if you're a leader, using that question as a starting point to design your services and to shape and train your teams. That's culture, that's complaints culture, and ultimately that's leadership as well.
Thanks, Ellen. And lots there and lots to kind of digest, lots in the chat as well. I can see that Jim and Lizzie have got their hands up. I just want to kind of recap, because a couple of things came in that I think are really important just to kind of gather kind of sentiment in the room. Actually, I think Claire's saying, love that you've highlighted the issue that, you know, doing the right thing can be interpreted differently by different people, which is why she challenges who champions, sorry, producing procedures that bake in expectations of the audience, organisation in practical terms. So things like, be kind is perhaps a little bit vague, and actually what can they do and how do they truly kind of demonstrate the values of an organisation is really important. John's saying that complaints only reflect a healthy culture if the organisation and its staff own the complaints and rectify the issues that are raised. And I think that's some of your kind of balance between restoration and kind of resolution. There are organisations that still have not got robust complaint systems in place. Tenants keep informing us nationally. I think that's important as well, and probably why the ombudsman was created in the and given those additional powers for kind of complaints handling in England. Alicia is just kind of agreeing with John there, saying as some landlords improve, the gap between she put them and the landlords who are lagging behind. I think tenants and landlords potentially, I think, or Alicia, if you want to come in and clarify that comment, please do. But essentially scarily far away from the national complaint system that the complaints code is meant to encourage. So I think we're talking about kind of gaps between kind of what we're meant to do from a compliance perspective, then okay, I guess what you want to do from your organisation, and then go from there. Alicia, just because I'm not clear on that comment, do you want to pop in first? You're not queue jumping, just so I can understand that a little bit more.
Case Management Solution Group, or CMSG, are the home of React, the UK's #1 case management system for ASB and community safety. We are delighted to have them as one of our key sponsors for Social Housing Roundtable 2025 into 2026. And with the ASB app now fully integrated to the platform, it allows residents to record, monitor and report issues directly to their case office in live time. What's not to love? CMSG are bringing simplicity back to case management, and I cannot recommend them enough and thank them for all of their support through this period and through the rest of the year. Thank you, CMSG, and do please go check them out on social media and on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Hi, Elaine. Yes, I am queue jumping.
Thank you. You're not queue jumping. Because I was reading your comment.
I think the thing we realise is that while some landlords are reacting and looking sensibly at complaints, which complaints aren't a negative things. Complaints are resident scrutiny of things which are going wrong in their communities, and there needs to be some mutual respect about the knowledge we have as the people living in those conditions. As I say, complaints aren't negative. It's us simply saying you could make improvements to the service we have. But what we are finding, and it is scary and it is upsetting, to be honest, what we're finding is that while some landlords are making improvements, and mine is one, they actually see complaints as a positive thing. There are some that are just lagging behind, and there's some landlords who over the past couple of years have made no improvements whatsoever. They've almost gone deeper and deeper into an entrenched way of ignoring tenants, of sidelining tenants. And I would say it's now up to the good landlords, the ones who are improving, and we're never going to get everything right, but the ones who are improving, to stand up and join with us, the tenants, to say things have got to change.
Thanks, Alicia. I think Eleanor, what's really interesting about that point is I guess there's these kind of three lenses, isn't there? There's what the government is telling you have to do, and that kind of compliance threshold. There's what landlords say they will do, the posters, the kind of promises. There's what they actually do and experience. And then I guess there's what tenants want. And somewhere between government telling you to do and what tenants want is potentially where landlords kind of find themselves. And it's really tempting, like you say, to just pick those compliance KPIs because there's so much going on in the sector. I don't want to call it bare minimum, because actually I think that the compliance is quite a decent standard, but actually what we're hearing today is the interpretation of that compliance, or the kind of alignment to that compliance, is slightly different or being perceived differently. And I guess to go to Claire's point, we say we do this, but we're all experiencing complaints in different ways and the impact of complaints.
Yeah.
Before I bring you in, and before I continue, because there's lots of comments and some really good questions in here, Jim, do you just want to summarise a couple of your points very quickly?
Yes, I've just actually now completed reading.
I
The
think it's a lot.
sorry.
There's a lot there to read, isn't there?
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is I've just from being on the landlord operations committee of my own housing association, the last meeting we had was again the TSMs of the complaints, how they're being handled, how they're being dealt through comms and everything. And what I found was that more and more of the advisors are almost being scared not to register as a complaint instead of a service inquiry, just in case it does resolve into a complaint. So then they're next on the block. Why is this gone to severe maladministration or whatever else? Because it's not being dealt with. So my concern is, are the figures of complaints we're seeing really the genuine complaints, factors there that are supposed to be there? When we look at the complaints, when we actually worked on the complaint handling code and everything, many of us, it was looked at as how do you define the complaint? And that was given the definition. But what's happening now is every issue is being escalated to complaints immediately instead of trying to find a middle ground to see if you can resolve it in the first instance.
Thanks, Jim.
A greater thing as well, if I may, and that isn't being looked at, is the effect that this is now having with the the for-profits coming into the sector and the sort of extra weight that housing associations and local authorities are facing to try and compete against this new onslaught from the charity commissions to what they can do, from the regulator, from the new building regulator coming through. All of these things are adding to that pot and that mix. And I think the more tenants ask for, it's good if it's a genuine complaint that it's dealt that way and it's dealt with properly. But most housing associations, long before any of the complaint handling code, had the benchmarks that they were hitting and looking at the key performance indicators. Nothing here I've seen at all new.
No.
So I just think it's got to be done levelly and equitably on all counts, not just loaded for the.
I just want to ask Eleanor actually before you move on to different points, because I think the first point was really interesting in terms of volumes of complaints, and that kind of point you made, I guess, Eleanor, about, if you measure it, it gets done, and actually, what's your experience with good landlords, or those landlords you're working with who are actually, embracing restoration over kind of resolution? Are they less focused on the number and volume? Because to me, I don't mind what it's called as long as we do something about it. But what's your view?
Yeah, so landlords who are managing this world do two things. So landlords that manage the repeat contact from a resident where they're reporting the same thing but nothing is happening with it, if they are also seeing their complaints volumes go up, they should be using that as a moment to say something's really not right here, we need to intervene. If, however, the number of repeat contacts into the contact centre or by email or to the housing officers is not increasing, but the complaints volumes are going up, it's an inflection point to look at. Is it the quality of our service delivery, or is it how we're defining a complaint? I think the thing with complaints, or the thing with customer service, or any service that's delivered by humans, is that it's always going to rely on a number of ways that you have to exercise discretion and judgment. And so we will probably never be able to get to a place where we can say with absolute certainty that this data is 100% correct 100% of the time. But it's about using all of those different types of data and sources of data available to you to weigh it up to say, what's this suggesting and what's this telling us? I think it's certainly my experience that landlords who are really committed to addressing the inequity of some service sometimes, or the root causes of services, will also be looking at things like which types of customers are, I want to say accessing, but reporting complaints more or less often than others, so that they can identify if there's groups of residents who are experiencing poorer services, whether that be in a geographical area or a certain type of home, or whether that's a certain type of demographic. And then equally using that data to say, actually, who are we not hearing from, and who do we need to do some proactive outreach work to? I think the constant challenge right now for housing associations, and as I said, I work independently, so I have no vested interest in any one organisation, is that everybody in a housing association knows that the best way to deal with complaints is to reduce the volume of them by having good services. It's logical, we all know that. But at the same time, because of the way that we are regulated and because of the way that there has been a focus on compliance, I've seen organisations spend hundreds and hundreds of £1,000s over a 3, 4, 6 month period on trying to manage complaints and stabilising them. And that, of course, takes away resources to be able to fix the issue at hand. So in all of this, it's about landlords saying, where is it best that we can focus our attention for the long term, and how do we have honest conversations with our residents about where we are now and where we can get to together?
Thank you. Really important, actually, because complaints are often a symptom of kind of broader kind of business failure or business concern, or perhaps where your ops aren't quite working in tandem to kind of meet the same goal. So I think it's really important that we see them as can openers potentially, rather than necessarily something that needs to be kind of managed and fixed. It's organisational wide, and that comes to your point around culture. Yeah. I'm just going to pop into the chat a little bit, then I'll come to you, Lizzie, because I can see you've got a couple of comments. But I just want to pick up on Emma's note here, that when she's been speaking with residents and tenants, they are often left feeling ignored when they call to a complaint, but the call taker does not does what they assume right, the procedure, and closes as resolved with no question. Of you feel we can resolve whether we resolve the issue, often not. But with the different level of complaints and resolution, it's not the number. It's the number of them, not the tenant's feelings. And I think that's just a little bit about what we've said there. Thank you, Emma. Lizzie, I want to bring you in. Conscious that we've got a couple of really good questions actually within the chat as well. So if you want to summarise a couple of your comments, because I think they're really important.
I'm interested in how so far everything's been very landlord centric, talking about how the landlord culture can be improved so that things can be done to tenants or for tenants. Of the 7 million or so people renting from these landlords, hundreds and thousands of us, or possibly millions, have our own professional qualifications and experience and expertise, which could hugely inform improvements in our landlord staff. I'm in my 70s, have a 50-year work history, mostly at a senior and chief exec level, and have therefore written complaints processes and managed other people to deal with people's complaints for decades. Last year, I wrote with a lovely young man called Dave Skinner. I wrote a protocol for complaints procedures. And we started with the premise of a strengths-based approach where tenants and leaseholders know what needs to be improved and what needs to be done, know a time scale that would fit into their life and into the problem that they're trying to get dealt with. And very, very often have backgrounds, as I do, in social work or teaching or health or community work or loads and loads of other things. Which would add huge value to an unskilled, often very young landlord staff team. Because the least skilled, and this isn't a put down of them, a lot of them are enchanting, nice human beings, but have no qualification or training or experience, are on a help desk or even on a computerized chat response, and may have 30 or 40 years less work experience than the tenant they're talking to. And I think that this adds to the problem that the being dealt with by somebody 40 years your junior, both in age and work experience, as a problem to be solved and resolved, rather than as a highly experienced adult who can help resolve the problem. Adds to the real difficulty. My landlord has a massively high dissatisfaction rate with the way it deals with complaints, and therefore responds every year when they get their tenant feedback with a whole load of the usual blather about how we're at the centre of everything they do. They use the word co-production to mean asking their tiny cherry-picked tenant panel to approve their policies, but not coming back to thousands and thousands of tenants who could actually be used as consultants to help improve these systems, and therefore turn round the power imbalance, and be seen as fellow expert professionals who are helping improve. Everything you say I agree with, except for the restoration of trust, because I have no trust of my landlord. I find them intensely irritating and very incompetent. And therefore, because they know I don't trust me either. And I think that we don't, instead of these endless round tables in both contexts, going round and round and round about stuff that's really self-evident, as you said, it's obvious if you improve services, complaints will reduce. We need to stop and say, well, why hasn't that happened? And bring in a different relationship with tenants where we are genuinely co-producing. We're paid for our time at the same rates as the senior staff around the table. We are networked into our own workplaces, can network into the housing providers to share our years and years of skills. I had about 11 years of professional training before I became a chief executive.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm just really conscious of time because we've only got
within the context of this, none of that is ever used. Very, very frustrating. I don't want to be given dignity by a 23-year-old. I want them to respect my existing dignity.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think, you've raised some interesting points there, and I think I just want to pick on one of them, Eleanor, in terms of, you talk about restoration versus kind of resolution. Why hasn't this happened before? I think Lizzie's point is, it feels like we've managing, society has been managing complaints and failure for a long time. Why are we having to talk about this now? Still, potentially, I think is what I got out of that.
Yeah, you're right. The 20 years that I've spent in housing, I'm talking about it just as much on day one as I am today. I would probably compare what it feels like to work within a housing association or within complaints and social housing generally to the NHS. So we can acknowledge that some of the systems in the NHS are broken, they don't work, but there are really talented, capable, committed individuals that work within that system to provide great care and service. And working within a housing provider, sometimes, to me at least, has felt very similar to that. And we are at the cross-section of the cost of delivering services and what we must deliver is constantly increasing. Government regulation about how we must do those things is increasing, and the funds we have available to do that are decreasing. And then there's lots of things like Lizzie has mentioned, retaining and finding the right people to deliver those services and being able to pay them fairly for their skills and experience, both from a resident side and from a staff member side. So as a housing professional, someone who's deeply committed to housing, it's rarely a lack of ability to be able to do these things. It's starting with designing out systems and ways of working and things that have been set up since the late 1800s in a modern environment, whilst also keeping the services that we have to deliver day to day going. And it's hard. We can get there, but it's certainly hard.
Thank you. Just going to jump in the chat, and then Jim, I can see you've got your hand up, but I'm really keen. I'm just conscious we've only got 15 minutes. I'm keen to bring Rebecca in as well. So just having a look at, because we've got a question in the chat about and I just saw it. Where was it? Bear with me. It was from Eddie Hughes, and he asked whether what your thoughts on using the AI in responding to complaints. He understands more tenants are using it to draft complaints, perhaps letters, but we really do need to ensure that housing associations don't lose touch of the personal touch and the human touch by using AI too much. Have you got a short response to that so I can get through the rest of them?
Alert Call return as one of the keynote sponsors for the Social Housing Roundtable in 2025 into 2026, and we're delighted to have them back. Alert Call help as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. As you can see from this touchscreen I've got with me, Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys, and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Call, an easier, simpler, and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare, and smoke alarms. Alertical work with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and their landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023, Alertical won Housing Supplier of the Year. We're delighted to have them back with us throughout the course of this year, and please do go check them out on social media and LinkedIn to find out more. Thank you very much, Alertical, for sponsoring us again.
Sure. So residents using AI can increase accessibility. If your first language isn't English, for example, and you're able to use translation into AI, fantastic. I'm all for it. I believe landlords should actually be putting systems in place so that residents can do that if that's how they would like to engage. I think the flip side of that is AI is much more limited than people think it is. It's designed to be intelligent or to appear intelligent. That doesn't mean it is. Some of the ways AI is great in complaints handling is, for example, in gathering all of the documents and creating a timeline, or being able to say, actually, a resident mentioned all of these things. Now it can compare it to your evidence in the investigation to make sure it's all there. I'm not so comfortable with letters being redrafted or written by AI, because the thing that is most important in a complaints investigation is that human contact. I'm not a fan of AI doing those bits, but it can certainly do some admin in the background for us. I'm very happy for it too.
I think it goes back to your point around how we all respond to the same circumstances differently. So if one thing, if my, window was broken, it would be, right, what can we do? We need to phone them for complaint. It might be something that's just inconvenient to me. For somebody else, that's absolutely the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. And I think it's just understanding that you need a human to understand the impact and the context often of what the complaint comes into. Just quickly in the chat then, before I come to Rebecca, John says, let's be honest here. If a complaint is not rectified by stage 2 and goes to Ombudsman and it is upheld, organisations must learn from that and adjust service delivery if required. I only say this is a criticism of the organisation, its processes, and not the staff. So perhaps we're too focused on policy and what spurts out of the kind of, you did this wrong, now do this, and we're being told again potentially, rather than understanding perhaps the cause and not just the symptom of the complaint. Claire is celebrating your summary of culture. It's hard to often get right, and you did it beautifully, she said. John's in agreement with the point around culture and how leadership defines culture, and I think some of your points really at kind of that board level, and what we can do there is quite important, and understanding that if we only see compliance metrics at board, perhaps that point I think you made around creating those KPIs around kind of the reason why you're getting a complaint. I think we're often, as landlords, and I don't know what you think about this, Eleanor, a bit scared to change our KPIs mid-year or add new KPIs mid-year, because we're so used to reporting on the same things from a trend basis. What do you think about that? Because actually, if you do find this out mid-year, are we going to wait for another 8-9 months to pop a KPI in to measure that? I don't know. What's your view?
Yeah, completely agree. I always suggest to the housing providers I work with, they use what I call campaign KPIs. So you don't have to keep that KPI forever. You don't have to tell every person in the organisation about it, but you can use it for a specific purpose. And the same in surveys. With the introduction of the TSMs, one of the disappointing things that has happened is that some landlords have stripped away that other survey program and asking for feedback. Now we've got this set of questions, but they're not asking why, or they're not using it as an opportunity to say, actually, this keeps coming up in the feedback, so we're going to pop a question in here to delve a little bit deeper. And we must be doing those things. And I will talk about the TSMs and the code as a hygiene factors. It's the bare minimum we must be doing, but we must be doing more on top.
Brilliant, thank you. Rebecca, we've got 10 minutes. I've got about 10 other comments to read out, but I'm really keen that I bring you in. Jim, if I've got time, I'll come back to you, but I know you've already kind of said what you need to. Pop it in the chat if you need to as well, if we run out of time. Rebecca.
I think there should be a hell of a tight scrutiny around the entire complaint system, because after you first view a property or accept a property, you're not in foster care, you're not being adopted, you're left to live your life. So the next point of contact is generally a complaint when something goes wrong. Now, if that complaint is met with toxicity and it's not progressed, it's not understood, it's not respected, it doesn't go any further thereafter, which is where the initial angst toward the landlord as an entire organisation can easily then creep in. And it's when you get stuck in that toxicity of not being able to have any ability to permeate past that system, that's when all trust can easily, it's as fragile as one pane glass. And I would love for there to be an ombudsman of housing complaints managers, so that there is a continuous educational programme, so that they're, don't mean to sound disrespectful, brought back down to human-centric earth, because a lot of these complaints voice managers are literally they're hanging out with a posse of senior management. So they tend to lose that human centric, and thanks, John. But they lose that human centric empathy. I mean, they could go home and try and envisage whatever situation I've put to them as a formal complaint. And they may as well be watching Coronation Street for all intents and purposes. They turn it off, they don't give a toss. So there needs to be a more realistic and human-centric approach, and there needs to be an empathic system whereupon it's continuously scrutinised, because in my own instance, it has been absolutely shocking and there's been no permeation whatsoever. In fact, it's felt like a cat and mouse game, where if I try and escalate my complaint, it's a little game of she may as well be stroking a flaming cat like Claude Greengrass, and laughing at me. That's how I felt. I felt absolutely ridiculed, and it's broken any basis of trust to powder. And no matter how hard I've tried to bridge that gap, there's never going to be a healthy relationship with my landlords, because I've had to deal with everyone, senior management, right up to the CEO. And it's now ended in a court case last week. It's going to end up in a 3-week trial. But it should never have to get to that.
Let's not go into that on the round table today. But I really, I appreciate
but it shouldn't ever go to that, is all I'm saying. There should be a lot more scrutiny as to how complaints are handled.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I mean, we do have, Elena, just, I think we do have kind of compliance processes in place. We have escalation within the Housing Ombudsman. We do have the conduct and competency standard coming in. Although actually thinking about from what Rebecca's saying, that doesn't necessarily kind of major on empathy, does it? It's about kind of those professional standards.
Yeah.
What's your view on kind of not necessarily, there's an argument to suggest we don't need more things to tell us what to do, we just need to do the right thing. But what's your view kind of from your experience, Elena, on that?
Yeah, so I agree with lots of the points that both Rebecca and Lizzie are saying about, the perspective of how we see people being kind of policed in doing some of these things, and who's making sure that they are doing what they should be doing. I think one of the most effective ways that I've seen that happen in practice was when a housing provider I worked with committed to paying a group of residents, and paying is really important here, for their time, for their expertise, for giving up other things in their life to be able to do it, to carry out quality assurance on the complaints handling process. And that quality assurance, there was of course a bit around things like the letter, was it sent out on time, was it in date? But actually it was much more focused around behaviours and the critical thinking behind it. Now, when I go into organisations, and I think this will probably feel a little bit uncomfortable me saying it to this room, one of the things that always strikes me is that people are rarely trained on how to make good judgments and what discretion looks like. And so when I deliver training with organisations, of course I tell people about the code, of course I tell people how to handle complaints, but actually the core of what we do is around how do you make good judgments, and how do you work in a way that makes sure that even if you're not able to do something for somebody, you're still giving them dignity, choice and control within that process. And I think if more housing providers move to that point of having paid quality assurance by residents, only a good thing.
Thank you. I think, what you touch upon there, I guess, to build that trust is understand that context as well. If you understand where that individual is coming from in the broader context of their complaint, then actually you might be able to have more empathy, you might be able to make better judgments. And if you've got a process that doesn't allow the flexibility to ask those questions of those residents and customers, then I think that's really tricky. Jim, I can see your hand up. I just want to ask, I just want to go through, because Lily's put in the comments here, and I'm conscious that we've only got 5 minutes. Really valuable, thank you. You mentioned that roundtable conversations can be particularly effective. She was just wondering if you had any other tips for resident engagement for addressing complaints, but also for addressing other issues that residents may not be directly aware of, especially when everyone has so many competing priorities. And I think that's a really important point from kind of perhaps a landlord perspective.
So I think the resident engagement piece, if we can call it that, starts with when a new person joins the organisation as a staff member. On day one, week one, through their entire experience, they have to be close to the resident from the moment that they join. We don't want the idea of residents to be really far away or an abstract concept. And so that can be things like videos from residents, having residents involved in recruitment and onboarding and training, and then that then starts to shape how services are delivered. And then within individual services, scrutiny projects, looking at where can we challenge the status quo of what's always been done, so that we can give residents more choice and control over how things are done. So I've had, lots of conversations about, well, we don't normally consult on parking, for example, and I'm saying, but why not? Let's do it. There's no reason we can't do it. So it's having that mindset throughout everything, but also balancing it with, and I think this is really important to remember, is that it is unfair of housing providers to make residents do the work, because it's us as staff members who are being paid to do it. So it's finding that balance of remunerating people for their time, their skills and their experience, and also making sure that people can just live in their homes and be happy and not feel like they always have to do more to get what's fair and right. So it's a careful balance.
Thank you. Rachel just said in her experience, the sector has changed considerably since the COVID and the pandemic. There's a culture of raising a complaint so that anyone who expresses dissatisfaction, even if there isn't a service failure, this hasn't helped us in my experience. Most staff handling complaints come from banking or private sector and do not have experience of housing. Just interesting there from that perspective. Claire said we need to be careful that colleagues using AI outside of business systems and putting their personal data in, either without any controls. And this isn't theoretical, it is happening. And I think that's an education piece about kind of AI and kind of the workplace more broadly. Alicia loves the idea of campaign KPIs. So do I. I'm a big fan of those. I'm going to use that. Steal that from you. Again, would create more reactive and bespoke service and allow us to generally kind of flex what we measure to make sure that it's in focus while we need it in focus. I think that's really important. Paul really liked your response on AI. Too much focus is on it right now, particularly in housing associations. And he suggests that the focus should be on tenants and not tech. John saying complaint staffs must not be in silos, and I think this contributes to some of what you've been saying as well about, challenging poor delivery is an organisational problem, although it's having the right staff in the place of authority to help shape the services is important. Remembering that at all times, complaints are not something on screen or paper, it's a human person. And I think that's really come across with what you've said today, balancing kind of resident involvement, resident kind of sentiment and kind of trust, I think it is what it is kind of coming back to. Just very quickly, Sharon said tenants always tell us it's not what you do, but how you do it that counts a lot. I think that's your culture point. And I think we've got 1 minute, Jim, if you want to come in very quickly before I ask.
Yes, I do actually. I was quite angry, to be perfectly honest with you, with what Lizzie Spring had said. It's not a matter of cherry picking. I've spent 20 years doing this, right? I've worked at it. I've learnt about it. To come in and talk about being at such a professional high standard is every single webinar I go on that she seems to attend, it's like a recruitment campaign for herself to find a job. I'm not being funny, but I'm finding it really irritating.
I think it's good.
It's difficult to get tenants involved as it is. I'm beginning to feel the more of these webinars that go on, unless you sing to the hymn sheet, you don't really want to know what's going on. If I don't sing in a socialist voice, then there's no voice to be had. So to be honest with you, I'm seriously considering just dropping out of the whole thing. But I just want to make that point clear that there has to be a right to reply.
No, absolutely. I think there is. I think we've just had a really busy
to be here. If you're only cherry picked to have your voice heard, then that's wrong, because that isn't the case. I was interviewed from outside by Yvonne Davis through Helena Housing, not Taurus. I've done it for 20 odd years, and it's the same song every webinar you go on.
Thanks,
So with
Jim. I think
respect, thank you for the opportunity to reply back.
No, absolutely, Jim. And I think it's really important, the round table is a place where we all have our different views and actually we have respectful disagreement as well. And I think, what we said at the start absolutely was that complaints are incredibly emotive and actually a real topic that affects people in lots of different ways, which is Eleanor's point. We are at midday. Eleanor, I just want to give you the opportunity to kind of say your last words because we've got lots of people thanking you in the chat. Lots of people saying, a sorry goes a long way. Is there a final closing thought before we ask everybody to kind of enjoy the rest of their day?
Thank you. So my final closing thought would just be, as a housing professional, the best way that we can move forward as professionals is to just constantly ask yourself. I ask myself this question 50 times a day. How can I give the resident that I'm currently speaking to more choice, control, and influence about what's happening to them? And I think it before I press send on an email. I think it before I tell my team the best way to do something or what the goal or the target is. And if all of us ask ourselves that multiple times a day in everything that we do, it goes a long way. Separately to this, I know there has been so many questions, so I'm more than happy to take a view of the questions and then share some information about that on LinkedIn, for example, if that would be useful for those whose questions didn't get to be answered. So I'll take a note of those questions and you're more than welcome to reach out.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Like if I didn't come to your question, I couldn't read your comment. I'm so sorry. It was really full, really engaging conversation and really appreciate your time. We will see you next week. And hopefully Matt will be back. So you'll be pleased to know that you get a break from me. Thank you again for your active contribution. I really, really appreciate it. It's what makes the roundtable really special. So take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.